Welcome to the 23rd session of Questioning the Present, an online public forum devoted to discussing contemporary political and cultural issues. I am Dilip Gaonkar, Director of the Center for Global Culture and Communication at Northwestern University and the Director of Center for Transcultural Studies, an intellectual network with roots in the city of Chicago, the two organizations that jointly sponsor this Questioning the Present forum. Today's 23rd session of this forum is devoted to Professor Elizabeth Anderson's Hijacked, How Neoliberalism Turned Work Ethic Against Workers and How Workers Can Take It Back, published in 2023 by the Cambridge University Press. We have two distinguished scholar respondents, Professor Axel Honneth and Professor Daron Acemoglu. I will introduce all three of them as briefly as I can, given their extraordinary achievements. Professor Elizabeth Anderson holds multiple named professorships at the University of Michigan. Max Shays Professor of Public Philosophy, John Dewey Distinguished Professor, University Professor, and Arthur M. Tarnow Professor. Professor Elizabeth Anderson specializes in moral, social, and political philosophy, feminist theory, social epistemology, philosophy of economics, and social sciences. She is particularly interested in exploring interactions of social sciences with moral and political theory, how we learn to improve our value judgments, the epistemic function of emotions, and democratic deliberation, issues of race, gender, and equality. In addition to numerous scholarly articles on these topics, Anderson has published following books: Value in Ethics and Economics in 1993, The Imperative of Integration in 2003, and Private Government, How Employers Rule Our Lives and Why We Don't Talk About It in 2017, and more recently, The Hijacked, the book under discussion today. She's currently working on a history of egalitarianism. Her prolific and groundbreaking work has garnered numerous awards and fellowships, of which I will mention only four. Professor Anderson was elected to American Academy of Arts and Sciences in 2008, awarded a Guggenheim Fellowship in 2013, and received a Genius Grant from the MacArthur Fellows Program in 2019, and became a fellow at the British Academy in 2020. Our second respondent is Professor Axel Honneth. He's a Jack Weinstein Professor for the Humanities in the Department of Philosophy at Columbia University. Prior to coming to Columbia, he was a C4 Professor of Social Philosophy at Goethe University at Frankfurt, where he also served as the Director of the Institute for Social Research for more than 2 decades. And he remains closely associated with that distinguished institution to this day. Professor Honneth's research covers a wide range of topics in social and political philosophy, as evident from more than a dozen books and hundreds of articles he has published over nearly 4 decades. His most influential books include The Critique of Power, subtitled Reflective Stages in a Critical Social Theory, published in 1985 and in English in 1991. The Struggle for Recognition, The Moral Grammar of Social Conflict in 1992 and in English version in 1995. Disrespect, The Normative Foundations of Critical Theory, published in 2000 and in English version in 2007, and Freedom's Right in 2014. His most recent book, The Working Sovereign, Labor and Democratic Citizenship, published in 2013, was profiled last year on the 19th session of the Questioning the Present here. Not surprisingly, he is the recipient of numerous awards, of which I will mention just 3. In 2015, Professor Honneth received the Ernst Bloch Prize from the city of Ludwigshafen in Germany. In 2016, he received a Bruno Kreisky Prize from Karl Renner Foundation in Vienna. In the same year, in 2016, he was awarded the Ulysses Medal, the highest honor bequeathed by the University College Dublin for his lifetime contribution to social philosophy and critical theory. Finally, our first respondent is Professor Daron Acemoglu. He's an institute professor of economics in the Department of Economics at MIT, and also affiliated with the National Bureau of Economic Research and Center for Economic Policy Research. His research covers a wide range of areas within economics, including political economy, economic development and growth, human capital theory, growth theory, innovation, search theory, network economics, and learning. His academic work has been published in all the leading scholarly journals in economics. In addition, he is the author of 6 books. Economic Origins of Dictatorship and Democracy with James A. Robinson, Introduction to Modern Economic Growth, Why Nations Fail, The Origin of Power, Prosperity, and Poverty, once again with James A. Robinson, Principles of Economics with David Leibson and John List, The Narrow Corridor, The State, Societies, and the Fate of Liberty, once again with James A. Robinson, and finally, more recently, Power and Progress, Our Thousand-Year Struggle Over Technology and Prosperity with Simon Johnson. Such an enormous and consequential scholarly work has earned him every conceivable award, fellowship, and honor, including the Nobel Prize in Economic Sciences in 2024, awarded jointly with his collaborators Simon Johnson and James A. Robinson, for studies of how institutions are formed and affect prosperity. In addition, he's an elected fellow of National Academy of Sciences, the British Academy, the American Philosophical Society, Turkish Academy of Sciences, American Academy of Arts and Sciences, of Econometric Society, of European Economic Associations, and Society for Labor Economists. Then there are numerous awards and prizes, including the inaugural T.W. Schutz Prize from the University of Chicago, Distinguished Sherwin Rosen Award for Outstanding Contribution to Labor Economics, John von Neumann Award from Reich College in Budapest, Carnegie Fellowship, Jean-Jacques Lafont Prize, Global Economy Prize, CME Mathematical and Statistical Research Institute Prize. So it goes on. There's a whole series of prizes. He holds honorary doctorate from University of Utrecht, Bosporus University, University of Athens, Bilkent University, University of Bath, the École Normale Supérieure in Paris, and London Business School. Perhaps I should stop here. However, before I conclude, let me make one final observation about our panelists today. As I said at the outset, this is the 23rd session of Questioning the Present, and arguably the most distinguished in terms of status standing of the panelists. However, this was one of the easiest sessions to organize logistically, as our panelists responded to my email invitations and inquiries promptly, usually in less than 12 hours, sometime in 5 minutes, as with Daron. In short, our panelists don't just write and theorize about equality, but are actually egalitarians in their social behavior, for which I'm much grateful. Now I hand this over to our featured speaker, Elizabeth Anderson. Here she is.
Thank you so much, Dilip, and I really appreciate Axel and Daron as respondents. I'm just going to share some slides here. So I'm going to start, the principal person I'm arguing against is Max Weber, who gave us our current image of the Protestant work ethic in his great 1920 work, The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. He advanced the claim that what began as an ethic to attain the assurance of salvation turned into a secular rationale for the capitalist exploitation of workers. I don't disagree with that at all. In fact, half of my book confirms that side of the work ethic. But I do think that he gave us only one half of the work ethic, and the purpose of Hijacked is to uncover the other half. So in particular, I'm going to disagree with the following claims that Weber made, namely that the original Puritans who invented the work ethic allowed capitalist exploitation of workers by any legal means. That the original Puritans also accepted that workers would bear all the duties of the work ethic while capitalists would bear all the profits, would win all the profits. And that and of course, Weber also advanced the hypothesis, which is largely true, that the Puritan wanted to work at a calling, and we are forced to do so. So I actually agree with that as well. What I want to highlight is what I call the other side of the work ethic. If you look back at the original Puritan texts, we find that, in fact, these Puritan theologians who invented the work ethic, they advanced egalitarian foundations for their work ethic. They rejected this class split we see in capitalism between who does all the duties and who gets all the rewards. The original Puritans promised material benefits in this world for workers. They didn't simply say that in this world you endure drudgery for the sake of salvation in the next world, or at least assurance of salvation. And an important feature of these original Puritans was that they attacked all kinds of predatory business models, even if they were legal. So I'm going to start with the great Puritan minister, Robert Sanderson. He wrote a very famous sermon that was reprinted deep into the 19th century called Ad Populum. And in this sermon, he argued that God instituted a division of labor and called every able-bodied person to work in some specific occupation. He articulated a metaphor of the clock. The division of labor works the way the gears of a clock do. Every gear in the clock helps and receives help in moving along. And so all the gears of the clock work jointly to produce its output, namely the accurate telling of time. They're all working in a sense for a common goal and helping each other along the way. And he thought the division of labor in society worked in the same way. Notice the clock metaphor has an implicit egalitarian foundation, right? You need every single gear. There's no gear to which you can attribute more work than another or more output than another. It's only all of them collectively working together responsible for the whole output. And what is the goal of division of labor in society? It is to maximize the well-being of the members of society in this world. That's the duty that God has given to us in this world that we must perform. So in Ad Populum, his sermon, he asked, how do we find our calling? And here was his answer. He said, first of all, rule out any kind of money-making activity that fails to advance the good of others. It's got to be honest labors that help other people. It has to fit your talents and your education. And it has to be something that the worker enjoys doing so that they are able to commit their enthusiasm for their entire life in this occupation. In other words, the exercise of talents and the service to others in that work, one should find fulfilling to oneself, and something that will sustain one's interest and commitment over one's career. What he's advanced then is an ideal of meaningful work, fulfilling work for the worker that also gets some kind of recognition from the people who benefit from it. We can also turn to Richard Baxter, probably the premier theologian of the work ethic. Over the course of his life, he wrote 400 books. So he was practicing the work ethic as well. Imagine composing 400 books in your career. It's not necessarily all that hard if you have to deliver a sermon every Sunday, right? A book every Sunday, essentially. So what are the duties of the work ethic? Number one, of course, is industry, working really hard. Performance of disciplined work in a calling. The second virtue of the work ethic is frugality, or what economists would call productive efficiency. Right? Don't waste any time, no idleness. Don't waste any material goods. God gave the earth and all its natural resources to human beings to serve humanity. So don't waste any of that stuff. And also save. Saving is more important than consumption. So that's frugality. And thirdly, asceticism, very important virtue. We shouldn't indulge in worldly pleasures and luxuries. Notoriously, the Puritans in England were the killjoys of the 17th century. But oddly, they also called for maximizing income. Work as hard as you can and make as much money as you can. But then the question is, if you're going to maximize your income, but you're not really allowed to spend it on yourself, and you can't let it go to waste either. So just piling up a lot of savings without putting it to use is also wasteful. And so what should you put your money to if you're making so much but not allowed to spend it on luxuries for yourself? And the answer was effective altruism. You should give away your money, pay your taxes, support public works and charity. So in general, what we have here is a kind of utilitarian duty to maximize the well-being of other people. And you do that primarily through work and secondarily through charity, works of charity, and also contributing to the public works through taxes. So what we get here, I think, is a different vision, the other side of the work ethic that Weber, I think, glossed over when I think it's really worth stressing. The duty to find a calling was converted by these Puritans into a right to free occupational choice, right? Only you know what kind of work will fit your, will be something that can sustain your interest and commitment over your entire life. So it's up to you. Nobody else can tell you what you have to be doing. The work ethic stressed the dignity of all workers, that even the most menial workers are doing God's work. And so from God's point of view, everybody's equal. Every worker is equal. Workers are entitled to meaningful work. Honest labor is profitable to the Commonwealth, right? It's helpful to the society in which you're working. Baxter stressed that it was important if in a wage relationship that employers not abuse their employees. He stressed they shouldn't be ruled tyrannically. Don't boss them around abusively. And that workers are entitled to safe and healthful working conditions and entitled to fair and living wages. And for those unable to work, they have a right to charity. Every particular member of society needs to be provided for. You can't let anyone die of starvation or exposure to the elements. And then finally, at the end, after a life of hard work and frugality and asceticism, people will be assured of that they will enjoy the saints' everlasting rest, that is salvation in heaven, where they won't have to do any work anymore. That'll be the reward of work, but it's postponed to the next life. Importantly, these Puritans stressed that the rich had duties, not just the poor. The rich also had to engage in productive labor. This is an explicit critique of the aristocrats who just hung around collecting rents and not doing anything to advance the good of others in society. And so they had a very harsh critique of the idle rich. They should be really working and advancing the good of other people, just like everybody else. They opposed business models that were based essentially on wealth extraction. Baxter condemned that as a prison and a constant calamity to one's own soul, to just spend one's life in doing little good at all to others, though he should grow rich by it himself. It's easy to recognize such business models at work in capitalism today. We could think of things like high frequency trading. Many private equity schemes are like this, where you can even extract profits through strategic manipulation of the bankruptcy code. So you could actually drive a going concern out of business and get profits from that. The Puritans imposed unfair and exploitative business models. Richard Baxter actually calls this oppression. He uses that very term, and he devotes a whole chapter of his 5-volume Christian Directory condemning oppressive business models, things like monopoly, usury, various kinds of fraudulent sales techniques, and grocers. These are people who try to corner the market, and unfairly evicting one's tenants from one's property. John Locke, another follower of the work ethic, argued that it was unjust to engage in price discrimination against the poor and desperate. If you're willing to sell a product for a given price in a given market, you should be willing to sell it for the same price to anybody. That's quite contrary to current models of algorithmic price discrimination. And what essentially they advanced was a class-neutral ethic. It doesn't matter whether you're rich or poor. If you're able-bodied, you need to work. And right, nobody's allowed to oppress anybody else. That's an instruction specifically to the rich who are in a position to oppress the poor and the less advantaged. What I argue in Hijacked is that this original Puritan work ethic became divided under the Industrial Revolution. That what happened in the Industrial Revolution, you see a sharper division, a very sharp division between manual workers and capital owners. And that division ended up dividing the work ethic itself. So keep in mind that from the Puritans' point of view, although wage labor existed, and Baxter said some important things about how wage laborers should be treated, the actual model workers and the predominant workers in England at the time the work ethic was invented were yeoman farmers and craftsmen. In the 17th century, yeoman farmers typically enjoyed 99-year leases on their plots. Imagine that, 3 generations, right? A man would sign a 99-year lease. He would work the land, the farm, for his whole life. His son would inherit it and work it. His firstborn son would work it for his whole life. Then it would go to his grandson, right? It's an incredibly long lease. It gives you essentially property interest in the land. Craftsmen, manual workers, they owned their own shops. If they were master craftsmen, if they were journeymen, they owned their own tools. So these standard workers of the 17th century enjoyed some returns on capital. And hence the duties and the benefits of the work ethic in the 17th century were actually united. And that was the standard model, I think, that the Puritans had in mind. But of course, in the Industrial Revolution, you see a sharp class division between manual workers on the one hand to become factory workers and impoverished agricultural day laborers in England. And on the other hand, you get the capitalist class, the ownership class, and to a certain degree, the managerial class who are running the factories, owning and running the factories. And that led to a split in the work ethic. What I argue, and this is the part that's against Weber, is that there was a prominent tradition through the history of political economy from Locke forward of articulating what I call the workers' work ethic. It's a progressive work ethic, which continued the tradition of seeing the duties and benefits of the work ethic united rather than split, right? Where workers do all the duties and capitalists get all the rewards. In the workers' work ethic, they wanted to continue that unity. If you work hard, you're entitled to benefits. What changed during the Industrial Revolution, though, was a change in morality, a drop on asceticism. That is, you don't have to be practicing self-denial. And there was a split between the workers' work ethic and the capitalist work ethic about what you do with all the prosperity generated by the new factory system in the Industrial Revolution. What the workers consistently called for in their organized movements was, have some leisure, let us rest, give us some free time. Limitations on the length of the working day were, of course, a central aspect of class struggle during the 19th century. The workers' work ethic continued the sharp critique of predatory business practices, especially labor exploitation. And what was the justification for their work ethic? Well, namely, we're the ones who are doing all the real work around here, regardless of our place in the division of labor, so we're entitled to commensurate rewards for that. On the other side, we get the capitalist work ethic, which is the work ethic that Max Weber described, where owners got all the profits and all the drudgery was put on workers. In this work ethic, there's an abolition of a duty to charity. Now everybody has to earn their way, and if they can't pay for whatever goods they need, too bad for them. They just had to depend entirely on their market wage, and if it's below subsistence, then they could starve. They might throw themselves at the mercy of the rich and beg for some alms, but the rich have no duty to give it to them. They do offer one thing, though, to workers, and that is an individual opportunity to rise up in the class hierarchy. If they work hard enough, supposedly, then they'll be able to climb. But the capitalist work ethic, for the most part, didn't like leisure. They wanted the workers to be working hard all the time. Instead, what they offered, part of the opportunity to rise, was the opportunity to indulge in luxury. And so we have already, long before Thorstein Veblen theorized it, an explicit advocacy of conspicuous consumption as a way to motivate middle-class workers to work really hard so that they can show off their luxuries to their neighbors and inspire envy in them, which will make their neighbors work hard to exceed the ones who've been showing off. And what's the justification for that version of the work ethic? It was the presumption that wealth tracks virtue, that the only way to get rich is to practice virtue, that is frugality, industry, right? And so if you're rich, it must be because, you know, you're working more efficiently, more productively than anybody else. And if you're poor, it must be because you're lazy and waste money and so forth. So as a result, we ended up getting two secularized work ethics, which have come down to us. The conservative work ethic, that's the capitalist work ethic, turned into what we know today in the 21st century as neoliberalism. But the other side of the work ethic, the workers' work ethic, ended up turning into social democracy. That's what I call in my book, the progressive work ethic. And here are the basic differences between them. On the neoliberal side, it's a very consistent story from the late 18th century forward. We see this very prominently in America. The poor are perceived as undeserving, presumptively lazy, and imprudent, not saving enough to cover the risks that they're exposed to. Whereas people who are self-sufficient, they have dignity and honor. It's a very American attitude, very strong today. Social Democrats insisted on the dignity of all workers. every particular person is entitled to a living wage, to a decent life. In the neoliberal version, the conservative version of the work ethic, you get shareholder capitalism, right? Firms exist in order to maximize profits. Policies that are advocated, things like low marginal tax rates, free trade, and so forth. A whole set of policies that are designed to favor capital shareholders over labor. Whereas under social democracy, right, the policy favors equitable growth. As the economy grows, wages should keep up with that. In the neoliberal version of the work ethic, there's a strong preference for private charity or workfare. So either you leave it to private parties to help out the desperate and the poor, or as a condition of getting access to publicly funded support for one's needs, you have to work for that. So we see today, for instance, reimposition of work requirements in many states just to get health insurance. Whereas social democracy was always one of the great innovations of social democracy is universal social insurance and unconditional benefits. In fact, as I argue, social insurance was originally introduced in Germany as an anti-socialist policy, a defense of capitalism, but social democrats rapidly took it over and expanded it when they gained power. On the neoliberal side, a lot of hostility to any time off from work. No unearned vacations. So in the United States, only half of workers have a right to a vacation, and that's only by contract. There's no legal entitlements to even a single day off of paid work. And a lot of skepticism towards leaves too, parental leaves and so forth. You can get that through contract with one's employer. But I believe there's only 2 states in the United States that actually provide for state-funded parental leave, and that's Massachusetts and Connecticut. Whereas on the social democratic side, leisure is like a major objective, right? You have maximum hours, paid vacations, generous opportunities to take leaves for all kinds of reasons with pay. Finally, with respect to the organization of work within the firm, very strong conservative tradition that turned into neoliberalism is what I call the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie. That is harsh factory discipline, the authoritarianism of the workplace, where workers just take orders and don't have any voice in what those orders are. Whereas in social democracy, that model, there's stress on worker autonomy and self-governance at work. In the United States, that tradition never really turned into social democracy, but we have a very strong ideology of self-employment, people self-directing their own labor, and also alternative business models that are more democratic, such as cooperatives, co-determination, a very strong model in Europe that for legal reasons can't be implemented in the United States. We'd have to change a lot of our laws to make that possible. And then, of course, also labor unions, both in North America and in Europe are critical, although that's a model in steep decline in the United States. In Hijacked, I take this original Puritan work ethic and I trace these 2 different secularized work ethics through the history of political economy. This ends up creating some strange bedfellows. So I classify Bentham who's normally seen as like a
accessibility shortcuts.
Radical.
Use the tab key to navigate and press space to toggle an option.
Malthus, Bentham, Priestley, Burke, and Richard Whately, who pretty much invented the ideology of imperialism, are on the conservative side. And on the other side, we have Locke, Smith, James and John Stuart Mill, Marx and Bernstein, Edward Bernstein, founder of social democracy, right? They're more or less on the same side, although the only one I think who really comes out on top from a moral perspective is actually Adam Smith. He was the only one of these thinkers who didn't have any criticism of the idea of public provision for the poor, and who condemned imperialism. All the others were either okay with imperialism. Actually, all the others were okay with imperialism, and many of them, in certain moments, adopted pretty harsh attitudes towards the destitute poor. So that's the basic overview of the book. The excerpt that I distributed was about the original Puritans, to show that there was already these two sides of the work ethic in their thinking, with the asceticism and the frugality. You can easily see how that could be turned against workers, and the requirement to work forever, endlessly, with hardly any rest. And I wanted people to see the harsh side, but also the progressive egalitarian side of those Puritans. I think that they were torn in two different directions, and those directions then were ripe for splitting off during the Industrial Revolution, which of course the Puritans didn't anticipate. Thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth. We are now going to go to Daron as our first respondent.
Thank you, Dilip. And thank you, Liz, for doing an excellent job of summarizing the book in 30 minutes. So let me first say I enjoyed this very much. Very impressive scholarship in terms of, going back to the origins of various ideas that I didn't know had some of those origins. And in addition, sort of bringing together a variety of different lines of thoughts into something quite original. And the center of originality, I guess, is not just the history of economic thought and philosophical thought here, but to use the work ethic as an organizing framework, and perhaps a very important part of how different societies have come to organize their attitudes towards wealth, inequality, and the broader set of institutions surrounding the market economy. I think this is a monumental work, a lot of fun to read, a lot of fun to think through. And there are many parts of it that I wholeheartedly agree with. I think in particular, and this is not about scholarship as much as perhaps values, but it intersects with scholarship. I think I share Liz's view that, the world would be a better place, a fairer place, with a more egalitarian interpretation of people's contribution to society, and also institutions that support a fairer distribution of income and status in society. And like Liz, I think social democracy was once a very important part of the implementation of some of these ideas. So there's a lot of similarities in my thinking, even before I read Liz's great book. But of course, if I were just to sing the books and Liz's praises, this would be very boring. So I take my job to raise some questions. And I see these as three areas that I have questions or different interpretations that do not necessarily contradict Liz's, but in some cases, they question whether the work ethic is so important for thinking about, say, the 20th century, and also the role of the work ethic moving forward from where we are. So I'm going to organize my comments around these three questions. Is the work ethic the right organizing concept for thinking of the big picture of what Liz calls capitalist development or market-based societies of some sort? It's more secular, more based on some sort of private economic activity, private ownership. Second is, what type of social democracy is most consistent with Liz's ideas, and what is the role of the history of economic thought, as well as Marx in some of these issues? So these two are somewhat idiosyncratic, perhaps, although the first one is about the sort of the organizing framework that Liz uses. The third one, I think, is the most important, and I'll spend some of my time, a good chunk of my time on that. I think the work ethic questions are very important moving forward, but perhaps in a different way than Liz is talking about, because a lot of recent developments in market economies, including some of the inequalities that Liz emphasizes rightly, and the future of work cannot be understood without thinking of the role of technology and the choices we make about the technological developments, including artificial intelligence, automation, and other digital technologies. And when it comes to these things, I think it's not as clear to me whether the work ethic has played a very important role in shaping these technologies, how they are developed, how they are used, how they are accepted. And B, we may actually need to build on what Liz is saying, but build on it rather than just the contrast that she's drawing between the conservative and the Protestant work ethics, in order to think about meaningful work, valued work, socially valued work in the future in the age of AI. And I think those are debates to which I think Liz would have a tremendous amount to contribute, but I'm not sure whether the strict contrast of conservative versus progressive work ethic would be the best frame for that. So those are questions. Those are not necessarily strict criticisms, but they are questions, and I would love to hear Liz's take on some of them as well. So I think starting from the first one, there's a strong version of Liz's thesis, which perhaps she doesn't subscribe to, but that strong version is sometimes sort of almost in the background, perhaps, as the way that I'm reading, which is that work ethic is the origin story, and all other organizational framework and the divergence of the organizational framework, say, between, say, Scandinavian social democratic countries versus the US, or over time, differences can be understood starting with work ethic, and then the other things related to institutions, status, pay, etc., very much build on that. I guess I'm not fully convinced by that strong version, and perhaps the strong version isn't the one that Liz has in mind, but if it's not, then there is the question of whether the work ethic is just a complementary part of a greater ensemble that requires a different organizing framework. So in particular, already political science, social science, economics emphasizes three big sets of influences on how different societies are organized. Economic power, who owns the assets and how they can control and use those assets. political power, who controls political power, including perhaps the military power. I'm not distinguishing the two, but one could. And then the third is ideological power or persuasion power. And I think the way that Liz is thinking about work ethic is as a central part of persuasion power. It justifies what is ideologically viewed as fair and just, and then other things follow from it. But I guess the test of arguing that work ethic is very important would be to say that somehow holding the same economic power, the same political power configurations, and holding some other elements of the ideological structure of a society, if we just change the work ethic from progressive to conservative or vice versa, we're going to get very different outcomes. I don't know of any evidence of that, and perhaps Liz can sort of chime in here in her discussion. But to me, it seems like the work ethic here is a very important, but perhaps secondary part of this ideological structure. And the much more important part is really about social status. The work ethic, as Liz explains it very nicely, is very important for social status. Part of what happens when you create the conservative work ethic, you give a very high social status to people who, say, control assets or companies, or live off the inheritance, or perhaps rise to prominence like Elon Musk or Mark Zuckerberg because of some lucky entrepreneurial breakthroughs, etc. But that is really much more about not just the work ethic, but it's about what, as a society, we value and give respect. And that respect, of course, is one of the most important currencies. It's not just money that people crave. It's social status, obviously. And it's also not just money, but social status that gets them, that opens doors, that is a very important element of who they partner with, who they work with, and all of these things. So it is absolutely true, and I think it's a very much in line with Liz's observation that United States has become very much gripped by a particular ideological view in which social status is very strongly married to economic success. And economic success is viewed as justly deserved, the just desserts discussion that Liz also has in her book that many economists and many philosophers supported as well. Now, the question again to me is work ethic part of this ensemble, or is this like own machine that's actually driving a lot of these interpretations? So could we, for example, how do we distinguish between, say, a story like Liz's, which has the work ethic at its centerpiece, versus, say, Michael Sandel's the meritocracy criticism, which doesn't mention the work ethic at all, but arrives to some similar, not the same, similar conclusions about the notion of meritocracy tied to income and riches being a very debilitating and unequalizing ideological framework for our modern societies. Some reasons to suspect that work ethic is just part of the story rather than its main actor. One is the tensions that Liz is emphasizing, for example, Baxter versus Bentham or Priestley. You know, similar things have been around for centuries and not always extremely tightly tied to work ethic. So, for example, if you go to Athens, ancient Athens, and Josh Auber's work here is quite telling. You see different periods in which some of them, during some of which periods you see the elites in ascendancy, and they command political power, they command economic power, and they are, as a result, able to monopolize status and virtue in their hands. But then you also see the backlashes against it, which take very different forms. So I don't doubt that during Baxter's time, the progressive interpretation of work was a very important part of that backlash against the more hierarchical, non-egalitarian versions of it. But say in Solon's Athens, it was the hubris law, which made it a capital crime for elites to behave hubristically towards Athenian citizens. Or after that, when about 100 years later, Cleisthenes came, he passed the ostracism law, which had the same sort of objective of cutting down people who had too much power and too much social status and presenting themselves as too virtuous to be able to boss around others, cutting them down to size, ostracizing them out of Athens by popular vote. Also, throughout the world, I think you see even more draconian ways of treating workers and giving them very little social status unless they play their role as cogs in the machine in places where the Protestants and secularized Christian work ethic hasn't had much of an impact. Say, for example, in China. In Chinese factories, the situation is, it's changing because of labor scarcity, again, emphasizing the role of economic factors. But until very recently, it was extremely draconian with no social insurance system, low and suppressed wages, and very disciplinarian conditions. But they had their own justification for this that amounts to the same sort of social status hierarchy of the more powerful being able to get their way without going back to the Protestant work ethic and its different sort of interpretations. The second question I want to talk about, and I'll be more brief on this, is what kind of social democracy? And here, I think there is a lot of agreement in how Liz sets up both the history and the important elements of social democracy. But there is one part of it that I want to take issue with, which is the role of Marx and Marxist ideas. I know this will get me in trouble because, for reasons that I never myself understood, Marx is still extremely popular among all sorts of social scientists. And I completely agree with Liz that social democracy came out of a mixture of liberal ideas and Marxism. But actually, in my assessment, reading of history, it was really the turning back on the ideas of Marx that was so important for social democracies coming into their own, both in terms of ideas and also, of course, in terms of communication, not being threatening to property owners, etc. So in that sense, I don't necessarily see that Marx's ideas are really so congruent with the progressive work ethic, because I think they start from different foundations. It is true, Liz does an excellent job of showing some similarities, but they start from very different foundations and their implications are very, very different. In particular, I think the virtue of Liz's development of the progressive work ethic and the Social Democrats' implementation of some of these ideas is that they are done in the context of a market economy, which maintains the freedom of economic actors to a degree that's still possible while upholding egalitarian principles, fairness, and sort of a general sort of work environment in which people's dignity and social status are respected. I think it is very difficult to trace these ideas to Marx. To a large extent, I think they have to be traced to abandoning many of these Marxist ideas. And in fact, many parties can claim to be the leader in social democracy. The Danes were there first in some sense, but the Swedish Workers' Party, which Liz also discusses, what's very interesting about them is that they really did an explicit turnaround away from Marx and accepting many liberal ideas, not just the market and bourgeois freedoms and bourgeois ownership that Marx was so against, but really sort of forging a very different philosophy than than anything that could come out of Marxist ideas. It is true, Liz is right, of course, that the Swedish Workers' Party, Bernstein, and many leading social democrats were Marxists and then acted as revisionists in the past. But I think that can be understood with the environment in which they were living. And I think the most important part of the environment, and there are some interesting works that sort of support this, is that the Bolshevik Revolution really created an intellectual sort of turmoil as well, that while before the Bolshevik Revolution, Marx was just, in terms of philosophy and in terms of economic contributions, was just one of many prominent thinkers, not really distinguished among them. He was distinguished by his activism, what he did in terms of the organization and the outreach, like the Communist Manifesto. But after the Bolshevik Revolution, you see an explosion in Marx's academic standing and sort of obscuring of many of the really difficult, inconsistent parts of Marx, which really would be a burden if you really took them seriously, including the labor theory of value, which Liz also mentions. So in some sense, I think going back and trying to rehabilitate Marx, of course, if that's true, it's true. It's if he said that, he said that. But I think we need to force it a little bit to rehabilitate Marx in this way. I'm not sure that that's the right agenda, and I think this is not just it's true both philosophically and from a political point of view. There is evidence from a number of papers, including work by Simon Jaeger and others, that when, for example, labor unions adopt more of a Marxist stance, they actually do not serve, but at the end weaken the social democratic sort of aspirations that Liz and I agree as the North Star here. Because just the overall interpretation coming from Marx and the reactions to it from other power holders just makes that agenda much harder. So that's an aside. But the last thing I want to spend a few minutes on is technology. So even if I agree wholeheartedly with Liz's framing, say, up to the 1980s, and I agree largely, but as I sort of indicated, probably as work ethic as part of a broader ensemble of ideological interpretations. I think the post-1980 developments, both in the United States and several other industrialized nations, are going in a very different direction. So my work, for example, which I'm not going to summarize, but I'll just give the bottom line, with Pasquale Restrepo, claims that about 60% of the increase in inequality in the labor market, not the billionaires, etc., but wage inequality, earnings inequality, labor market earnings inequality, is about how you use technology, in particular automation. So a lot of the inequality is driven by the fact that workers who used to perform tasks that were then automated lost their economic standing, and together with it, therefore, their social standing. Interestingly, we also found the demographic groups that were most at the crosshairs of automation have experienced quite significant declines in their employment to population ratios. So in other words, it's not the last 40 years doesn't look like one in which, whether it's the work ethic or other things, is forcing people, especially low income, low education groups, to work too much, but there aren't enough opportunities for them at wages that they find desirable. I think all of these tensions are going to become multiplied with the direction in which artificial intelligence is being developed as a supreme automation technology, for example, with the aspirations of artificial general intelligence. And if it goes that way, it would really be a huge shock to any type of society that we can imagine existing around the world today, and very strongly to those of industrialized nations. In this context, I mean, some of these topics may be tangential to Liz's focus, but I think there are two important touch points that need to be emphasized. The first is that I think, to me, a holistic account of where we are cannot be provided without recognizing the central role of the technological developments and why technology has really behaved this way. So I definitely reject, and I think evidence is very clear in rejecting this, as viewing technology as an exogenous force that just happens as manna from heaven. Technology is the apex of our knowledge, of our social organization, of our market organization. So if technology is going in a particular direction, it's because we chose it to go in that direction. So the question is, can work ethic and ideas around it explain why is it that over the last 40 years we have used technology in a way to sideline workers? And I think there will be a tension there, because the conservative work ethic is about making people work harder. So if that's the organizing framework, why would that be complementary or synergistic with actually using all these machines to sideline workers? On the other hand, those based on political power and social status of the billionaires and the tech billionaires and those who make money, I think those are the forces, together with the weakness of unions, that provide a better ideological and social framework for understanding why technology has moved in this direction. And the second touch point, and I will conclude with that, is that Liz's ideas of work ethic actually have a great relevance for the future. Because one of the reasons why many people are not as alarmed by the direction in which AI is going, is because they have drank a silly Kool-Aid, which convinces them that somehow AI will mean they're going to have more leisure and they're going to live their lives, and somehow either the government or some scheme is going to transfer resources to them from the enormous profits that tech companies are making, so the future will be okay. Let alone the implausibility of tech barons to actually agreeing to distribute their profits to workers. But even if the benign version of that story were to materialize and people left their jobs to AI and instead they lived off universal basic income or some dividend based on tech company profits, is that a meaningful life? Does that provide purpose, dignity, and more importantly to me, does it provide social status? And I think the ideas that Liz develops have a lot to say on that. Can we really have a dignified life for workers in which, say, 80% or 70% of workers don't really have a job and they just stay at home? Could that be coupled with a reasonable social status, social standing for them? Or would it be, as I suspect, one in which people who live off the crumbs of tech profits would actually be viewed as second-class citizens, even more so than today? So I actually believe that Liz's ideas need to be married by a deeper analysis of what the future of work will be, together with the direction of AI and how we're going to use AI, how we're going to regulate AI. Overall, let me just repeat, this was absolutely fascinating. I'm so happy to be part of this conversation. I've learned a lot from the book, and despite the fact that I've raised some questions, I don't think these should be interpreted in any way being critical. These are just the thoughts that were provoked by an excellent book. Thanks, Liz, and thanks, Dilip, for organizing it.
Thank you, Daron, for an excellent set of comments. And now we move to our second and final respondent, Professor Axel Honneth.
Yeah, thank you, Dilip. Thank you also for having organized this meeting, and thank you for having included me in this extremely interesting exchange. My questions, as you will see, are not as far-reaching as Daron's ones. I will keep my questions to some internal points in the book by Elizabeth. But let me start by also mentioning and saying how much I enjoyed reading the book, and to mention that I find it extremely impressive in at least three very different respects, and I would like to start with that. First, it is for me a model in interdisciplinary research. And by that I mean an interdisciplinary research that is not coming from a kind of academic device or academic program or project, but it results from what it means to analyze a phenomenon deeply enough. So the interdisciplinary approach is set by the phenomenon, by the thing in itself, and not by aiming at combining certain disciplines. So in combining intellectual history, political theory, social sciences, and normative argumentation, I think Elizabeth's book is a model for all of us, and in that sense, it could count as an idea for what it means to understand a phenomenon, namely work, when taking it seriously and realizing that to study work means to employ very different disciplines. This kind of interdisciplinary approach is so convincing that you as a reader, you not even realize how quickly you are jumping from one discipline to the other, because they are somewhat enormously integrated in one line of argumentation. The next respect in which this book deeply impressed me was by a completely, for me at least, new reading of the Puritan work ethics. I mean, I grew up in Weber scholarship, and so it meant to learn that the Puritan ethics, when being realized in modernity and in the process of secularization, had a very tragic outcome, namely the outcome of social pathology, namely that we all think we have to work without knowing why exactly. So losing the ethical understanding of why we think we have to work. Now, what Elizabeth is doing here, she is presenting a completely new interpretation, both of the English liberal tradition and the conservative English tradition, as resulting from two very different readings and understandings of one and the same Puritan work ethic. I think this is really new, and it leaves the traditional interpretation of Max Weber, because, as I said, the traditional interpretation of Max Weber is to tell us that the Puritan work ethics has a tragic outcome as soon as it is realized in the process of modernization, because the process of modernization takes away the ethical deep understanding of it and leaves us with a disciplined world, an iron cage, yeah, where we are supposed to work without knowing any longer why. Now, in difference to that, Elizabeth is interpreting the Puritan work ethics as entailing two different messages, and this is extremely interesting. She understands the two traditions of English liberalism and English conservatism as being in a permanent dispute resulting from the Protestant work ethics, but being in a permanent dispute over the normative implications of free markets. Whereas the representatives of the liberal pro-worker work ethics, namely Locke, Smith, John Stuart Mill, up to Eduard Bernstein, assume that free markets are meant to guarantee laborers' entitlements to dignity, to meaningful work, to decent material conditions, and to freedom from oppression. The conservative tradition takes it that free markets are institutions selecting paths for capital accumulation by private owners under the guidance of the state. I think this is a really new interpretation of the Protestant work ethics, from which I learned a lot, and it makes me enjoying the book enormously. Now, as it stands, I would have much more questions with regard to this revolutionary new account of the impact of the Puritan work ethics on Western debates on the market than my time allows. I will therefore leave aside some very obvious questions, and I mention only two or three. The first obvious question, which I will leave aside, is what about the French tradition from Rousseau to Durkheim, which could have changed the picture dramatically, because they don't start, I think, from the Puritan work ethics, but from some very different spiritual or intellectual sources. So what also about the empirical assumption that most people today still view work as fulfilling a duty to contribute to society and a central locus of meaning. I mean, most empirical research shows that people more and more tend to a more instrumental relationship to work. So the question would be an empirical one. Is it still true that what informs us in our daily labor and what gives ethical meaning to our daily labor is exactly the Protestant or the Puritan work ethics? I also could ask the obvious question whether the picture of hijacking is the correct one. Yeah? Because if it is true that you have in the Puritan work ethics already two different ideas on work and on the market and on the relationship between capital and laborers, then probably the whole picture of hijacking is a little bit misleading. But I leave all these questions aside, which I think are interesting questions, and will instead concentrate on three questions that, in my view, are much more pertinent. First, by taking the Puritan work ethics as the central source for advocating a progressive politics of work, you, Elizabeth, buy in some socio-ontological premises that might be of disadvantage for your central normative purpose. The Puritan ethics understands work as a duty we primarily owe to God and only secondarily to all other members of our community. The duties we have towards our fellow citizens are derivative of our duties to God. With this comes a picture of the individual person as gaining his or her dignity, standing and calling essentially from the vertical relation to a higher authority and not from the horizontal relation to his or her fellow citizens. All the limitations that Locke puts on the acquisition of the bounties of nature are understood as indirect dictates from God, not as restrictions we as members of a community take as being normatively recommendable for our social well-being. This reference to a higher authority, such as God, can no longer be found in John Stuart Mill's own account of political economy that also opts for high restrictions on property owning and even advocates workers' cooperatives as institutions enabling the elevation of laborers' self-respect. The reason that Mill believes he can abstain from any vertical reference to a higher authority is simple. He starts from the normative premise of a community of equal citizens and asks what they owe to each other for the sake of establishing social cooperation that allowed each to enjoy individual freedom and dignity. My question, therefore, is this. Why do take the detour to the Puritan work ethics with all its religious premises and load, when it would be much easier and less presuppositional to outline the principles of a progressive politics of work by referring to the normative idea that all citizens in a democratic community deserves it to be treated in and outside the working place as equals, autonomous, and in that sense, dignified persons. So I think we could derive the principles of social democracy much easier by searching into the presuppositions of a democratic citizenship. What does it mean to belong to a democratic community? What kind of duties do we have in order to become good citizens? I think that would be an easier way. So the question is simply, why taking the detour? There must be some reasons you have for taking this long detour into a very convincing and extremely deep study of the different writings of the Puritans at the 17th century. I could put the question somewhat differently and more provocatively by asking, how do you see your book on the Puritan work ethics to be related to your critical study on private government, where you based your defense of a progressive world policy on the tradition of labor republicanism? So there you seem to rely on a completely secular tradition, namely the democratic republican tradition, whereas now you think you have to go deeper, namely into the Puritan roots of our probably current self-understanding. So the question is simple, why taking this long detour? The second question is the following. In the way you present the Western debate, and I have to say this is intentionally and set by Elizabeth, a study only on a Western discourse. Yeah? So you exclude intentionally, let's say, other areas, other cultural horizons, and you concentrate on a Western debate. So in the way you present this Western debate in modernity on the economy, it looks like as if there are, besides the dead end of the communist project of a planned economy only two alternatives, both resulting from a specific interpretation of the Puritan work ethics, and both offering on that basis rival views on how to shape free markets. The pro-workers wing argues in the tradition of Richard Baxter that markets have to serve the laborers by guaranteeing them meaningful work, freedom from oppression, and sufficient, decent material conditions. The conservative are or the neoliberal fraction argues in the tradition of Joseph Priestley that markets have to serve private owners by paving the way to unrestricted capital accumulation. But are there not much more intellectual movements in play in the modern discourse on the market that do not fit either of these two currents, because they argue either for a complete reorganization of markets or for putting heavy restrictions on markets as such? There is, on the one side, the young tradition of market socialism, and there is, on the other side, the very old tradition of moral economy, and both you seem to completely leave out when reconstructing the modern debate on markets. And I think it changes a little bit the picture when we take into view these two other traditions, the young tradition of market socialism and the very old tradition of moral economy. Both traditions are of importance for our debate because they add something to our understanding of markets that can't be seen from the viewpoint of the Puritan work ethics out of conceptual limitations. Market socialism wants markets to be supplemented by collective actors, namely by workers' cooperatives, so that the duty to contribute to the welfare of society is transferred from the individual to collective bodies, and the individualistic premises of the Puritan work ethics therefore are refuted. So I think that the Puritan work ethics brings with it an extremely individualistic understanding of the market participants, especially with regard to laborers. Laborers are understood as individual persons, each having a certain duty primarily towards God and then secondarily to the social community, whereas I think market socialism, and probably already Marx, to a certain degree, changed that picture of the market by introducing into it collective actors, especially cooperatives, as seen by market socialism as being of highest importance for reshaping the market. Let me see where I am. Work becomes here, in the tradition of market socialism, a source of pride and dignity, not for the isolated individual, but for the cooperating association of workers. So my question with regard to market socialism is whether the Puritan work ethics is not conceptually bound to a very individualistic understanding of workers, because they are introduced as the isolated believers. I mean, that's the Protestant root of the Puritan work ethics, that you have in the background, you have the isolated individual being anxious because of not knowing whether there is any salvation in the future, and therefore the isolated subject is searching for a remedy. The Puritan work ethics offers a remedy, but it makes the individual even more isolated because it sees his or her own obligation towards God. towards God. So I think that might be a very restricted vision of the market. Does this not mean that the Puritan tradition is not longer capable of intellectually inspired economic reforms that favor the collective over the individual? That's my question with regard to the tradition of market socialism. There's a similar devaluation of some of the premises of the Puritan work ethics when one takes the tradition of moral economy into consideration. Moral economy is a name for a very old tradition in economic thinking that shouldn't be confused with what Max Weber called traditional economy. For Weber, traditional economy referred to the basic idea to work only as much or as long as it is needed for one's subsistence, whereas moral economy, as an umbrella term for the claims of many plebeian, poor peoples, or proletarian movements, do have an unconditional right to subsistence as their central claim. This right to subsistence, it's the central assumption of moral economy is simply that whatever the social standing and abilities, the poor and the well less off have a social right to subsistence. This is best laid out in many writings of James Scott. This right is supposed not to reshape markets, but to limit them strictly by taking certain basic goods out of the market, like land, housing, food, or health. So this is not longer a debate on what shape a market should take, but it is a discussion on the question what goods should be taken out of the market in order to satisfy the central right to subsistence for the poor and those worse off. Does this not mean that this Protestant tradition cannot be the only intellectual source from which we can learn today when it comes to discussions on the future of capitalism? I mean, all the discussions on affordability we have now in the United States have much more to do with a basic right for subsistence than with the tradition of the Puritan work ethics. If I have, I would have a third question, if time allows me to raise it, and it will be very short, but I think important. By relying heavily on the liberal tradition of a pro-worker work ethics, you risk to implicitly accept its very narrow understanding of what constitutes that kind of work that guarantees property and with it dignity. Since John Locke, such work is conceived of as labor that we carry out with our hands when appropriating and cultivating the bounty of nature. Farming, manufacturing, and industrial work is that work that is seen and understood as genuine work. Genuine work is characterized by productivity. So in the tradition from Locke onward, and I'm not sure about the Puritan tradition, in the tradition from Locke onward, Smith, John Stuart Mill, Marx, Eduard Bernstein, everything you mentioned, there is not only a tendency, but there is a clear decision to understand as work only that kind of laboring activity that contributes to the increase of goods. And that means it is work we call either industrial work, you call it work by hands, manual work. So the upside of that is that there is a tendency in this tradition of taking on the Puritan work ethics to exclude from our picture of work all the rest of laboring activities, let's say from cooking over caring, over teaching, over administration. The question is simply then whether this reduction of labor to productive fabricating work is an original sin of the Puritan ethics, or whether it is a mistake committed only by the English liberals when inheriting the Puritan tradition. That's one side of the question. Yeah, is this reductive understanding of work already an implicit property of the Puritan work ethics, or was it only added to it by famously John Locke, I think, who was the main one responsible for that reduction, which was then taken on by all the tradition you are mentioning. And the question would be how to heal that reduction. I mean, it needs clearly an enlargement of our understanding of work. The question then will be, what do we treat as work in a society? When we want to include in it care, work, cooking, private activities, but don't want to include in it what we call very often hobbies, because hobbies are not directed to the community, but are self-serving. So that is an extremely difficult conceptual question, which I think is brought to us by these Puritan work ethics and makes us think about how best to define what should be counted as work in the division of labor in the sense you want to have it. So these are my three questions. And I, again, thank you very much for having written the book, which I enjoyed enormously to read, which gave me a new view on the Puritan work ethics, and which I'm sure will raise a lot of questions in the future. Thank you.
Thanks you, Axel. Time seemed to be flying because of such wonderful ideas and comments. Elizabeth, you have some time now to respond, but we are approaching the end. Okay.
So thank you very much for these very rich comments. There's a lot of stuff that to address here. I won't have time to do everything. I want to say, first off, that I basically agree with pretty much everything Daron says. I agree that you have sources of economic and political power that are not, that have ideological influences and legitimation stories that aren't entirely work ethic based, even in the West. I take exception to your characterization of Sandel's story about meritocracy as not really about the work ethic. I think it comes straight out of the work ethic. Right, it's the conceit that the rich, right, are more productive, that they're like, working harder and more talented and so forth. But the key thing that I agree here is that there is a major missing figure, which is super important, and that's Rousseau. And in fact, I recognize that I didn't fit it into Hijacked, but as Axel knows, I gave a series, the Dewey Lectures at Columbia University, looking at Rousseau's contributions, and they're very pivotal for understanding inequalities of social status connected to wealth. And he tells a very different story because he's not at all coming out of the work ethic tradition. So I agree, with that view. I'm with Daron here. I think that the chief intellectual advance of social democracy with Edward Bernstein was to toss out all the major premises of orthodox Marxism. So I won't even. I agree entirely with that. A lot of what I'm doing is I'm doing intellectual history and not pure normative thinking. So I'm tracing influences and not endorsing even some of the figures who I think were participating in, a certain tradition and having an influence on how it developed. With respect to the critical question of technology, I think, Daron, although you didn't say it, in other places I've heard you talk about a kind of two different directions in which technology like AI could be implemented. One would be, the tech bros get all the money and all the power, and you have mass unemployment. That would be a catastrophe for exactly the reasons you say. And while it's true that people that often people will not say explicitly that the importance of work lies in the meaning it gives to people's lives, especially when men are unemployed in the United States, it leads to massive depression, isolation. I mean, really a collapse. And when you ask them, when they're asked why they feel this way towards their condition of involuntary unemployment, it's not just that they like not earning and standing on their own 2 feet. It's that they feel useless. That's important, right? People need to, I think the need to be useful, to help other people is very important for human flourishing. That you're not just, consuming, you're doing your part in society, and other people, right? Meaning has to come from something bigger than just oneself, right? And its connections to others, positive connections for most people. So I do think that, and I agree entirely with Daron that this idea of a universal basic income as substituting and having this glorious leisured post-work society is not so great. Not only is it not plausible, but if there was a universal basic income, it would just barely keep people's heads above water without actually, it's not really a great model, even if you could implement it. In response to Axel's comments, I agree with various limitations. I'm only looking at the Western debate. I think that's true. And I also agree that there are these other traditions that have to be taken into account. I do want to say, though, that with these Puritans of the work ethic in the 17th century, Baxter marched with the parliamentary army in the English Civil War. Okay, he was a chaplain. Now, he wasn't the most radical of the parliamentarians, but there was an important rise of democracy during that era that then got crushed with the Restoration. And in fact, the Republican tradition was quite radical in those days. Proposals for a reformed English Constitution called for the abolition of the House of Lords, for instance, essentially the elimination of the aristocrats' power. That's a very radical position. They wanted a universal male franchise. Pretty radical. Right. And in fact, that those ideas were seeded in the 17th century, and it took England like 300 years to realize them, but there's really big deal there. And that notion of democracy is latent already, I think, in the Puritan work ethic, but it's not articulated. But you could see in practice that it was coming. These ideas are seated there. And so this notion of the collectivity, I think, is absolutely central. It's central to social democracy too, and the democratic elements are really important. And I wasn't focusing on them so much in my work, but I do want to take a couple of exceptions to Axel's interpretation of these Protestants. Number one, although they're extremely individualistic about salvation, ironically, their views of how the economy should be organized, with the clock metaphor, it's a very communitarian view, right? We all have to work for each other. We all have to be helping each other, and not just ourselves. We had to take care of every particular person, including the destitute and those unable to work. And there's collective duties. And at the same time, there's also a vision of autonomy, right? You can trust workers to choose their own career. That's, a better way to allocate your labor than something else. And so I also see the market socialist tradition, although it has numerous sources, one of those sources, I think, is in the work ethic. And I touch on that when I discuss the Ricardian socialists, who are a motley crew, not easy to pigeonhole, but some of them did have that more, cooperativist vision. And I do think that although again, I have other themes in other works, especially private government, where I criticize the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie quite explicitly. Here I'm not that much focused on it, but I'm still really criticizing that whole model as basically totalitarian, especially in the hands of Bentham and his panopticon vision of how to deal with the poor. And Axel, you're entirely right about this producerist ideology that we see from during the Industrial Revolution. It's a manual work. Baxter himself, though, recognized that women doing care work in the home were fulfilling the duties of the work ethic. So while you couldn't call him a feminist, he did recognize the universality of labor, child rearing, cooking, all that caregiving, right? That's work too. And although that was, I think, radically demoted as a conception of work during the Industrial Revolution, and even Adam Smith is really not a good feminist, right? He's his notion of productive labor is totally about manufacturing, agriculture, manual work that produces independent material objects, and not about other kinds of work like education, knowledge work of various kinds, right? It's not really in his picture that much. So I agree with that. And I do think it's very important then to expand our notion of work, and in particular to understand that lots of work isn't paid. And Baxter already made room for that, but he didn't stress it. And most of his preaching is directed to men who were actually making money, at their work. So we should open up for questions then.
Daron and Axel, would you like to make a comment?
Nothing from me. Thank you, Liz.
Yeah. Axel?
I would have a short one, but I don't know, maybe many other people want to raise questions. So I probably, one point. I didn't want to say that the Puritans, when outlining their vision of a fair economy, were not having in view the division of labor. I see that. That's clear. Yeah? And it's very important that they bring up the whole idea of the division of labor and how the different laboring activities hang together by the organized division of labor. What I meant was something else. They can conceive of labor only as something carried out by an individual, not as something that is done cooperatively.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so that I see as a certain individualistic heritage of the Puritan work ethics that limits probably our view on how best to organize labor in the future.
Yeah. But John Stuart Mill, of course, with his work on workers' cooperatives, he's taking a major advance there.
That's true. Yeah.
Okay, now we have floor open. Vidura, do you have some names already?
We have some questions, Dilip. I'll start with Pratama's question, Professor Pratama Banerjee's question. And she asks, what if we distinguish between the two concepts of labor and work? Labor as that which offers a measure of equivalence across intellectual, creative, and manual work, but work as that which is always already disaggregated. What does one do with sex work, care work, and degraded menial work such as janitorial and sanitation work, which can only be valorized as labor by abstracting from the actual embodied experience of the work? I mean, we have two more questions from the audience, but maybe you could respond to this and we'll take the next two together.
Yeah, I'd like to say that there are creative people working in this space to make these kinds of work meaningful, even like janitorial work. There are things that can be done to enhance the autonomy of such workers and to upskill and to also make it more social and cooperative, teams of workers and so forth. That would take me down a line that would make me run out of time, but there are things we could do.
So I think next to, people who have questions, Craig, could you ask your question, and then perhaps Suraj, you could follow and you could take those questions together.
Okay, sure. First off, though, terrific book and presentation, Liz, and really insightful and well-articulated comments, Daron and Axel, both. This has been terrific. Building partly on the comments from Daron and especially Axel, I want to ask how stable you think the idea of two traditions is, Liz, and whether it would help to, for example, distinguish neoliberals from conservatives on the right, and social democrats of the not very radical, not very socialist sort from more radicals, socialists, communitarians, and so forth on the left. And would this give some purchase on the issue of instrumentality as an issue, the extent to which the liberal and neoliberal and many social democratic positions reduce work to a very instrumental relationship with very little attention to qualities of work and the things that you were just talking about, self-realization in work, expression in work, and also community and collective flourishing, which figure for conservatives, moral economists, some market socialists, and which often have reference to what we might think of, following Charles Taylor, as higher goods of one kind or another, religious in some of these discussions, but community, culture, and so forth. Would you welcome pursuing that kind of further distinction?
Oh, yeah, for sure. Right. I mean, partly is that, you only have so many words. So it does involve compressing distinctions, which could be usefully, spread out some more. I agree entirely with that. And also, I just want to point out that one of the themes of Hijacked is that there's this, because of the original Puritan ambivalence, a two-sided view of work, that even people in what I call the progressive work ethic tradition, there's always a temptation to slide back. You can see that, for instance, in the Hartz reforms in Germany. You got social democrats who are adopting, you see this repeatedly, and I show episodes of that, in the history of the progressive work ethic tradition, and that's one of the reasons why Smith is actually the hero of the book, ironically. And I just want to point out that if you read my book, you'll see that what I think is a more accurate understanding of Smith, he's always on the side of the workers, not on the side of the capitalists. And he's just been systematically misread. This is actually very well known among Smith scholars, but totally unknown outside of that small circle of scholars.
Okay.
I think Suraj has a question, Dilip. Maybe
Okay, go ahead.
I think we'll just have time for one more question. So, yeah.
Suraj, go ahead and ask a question.
Well, thank you, Professor Anderson, Professor Acemoglu, and Professor Honneth for such illuminating conversation. I have learned a lot, and it's a privilege to be in your presence, albeit virtually. My question is to Professor Anderson, and it's drawing upon the comments from both the commentators. I wanted to invite you to say a few words in terms of the broader methodological approach you are taking in Hijacked. So, given that we have the problems that you diagnose, it seems that in addition to ideological power, there is a question about political power and sort of reclaiming political democratic institutions. And so, democratic control, or as Professor Honneth was mentioning, that taking the easier and less presuppositional route of democratic citizenship, right, might be a way forward in terms of looking at solutions to the problems that you have. So, could you please say a few words in terms of why the hesitation in this more recent work to take that route? Thank you, Professor.
Yeah. So look, I agree entirely. So let me I think I could connect your question to something that Axel said about, why don't I start from first premises, right? Why do I go back earlier to the 17th century? And one of the reasons why is that I'm largely addressing an American audience where work ethic presuppositions are so powerful. So you start persuasion from where they are, and while they're not back to the Puritans, exposing the origins of current attitudes that Americans have by locating it further back helps people see that the possibility of alternative articulations of fundamental values. Now, so it's a kind of persuasive strategy to see that there are other ways, to think about the work ethic to which so many Americans, although it's totally secularized now for the vast majority of Americans, it's still such a driver, I think, of status. Right, that's really the key thing, and so showing that there's an alternative way to go with these ideas that I think is more compelling and more consistent, actually normatively consistent with the origins. I think is really important and ties into some things that actually do upset Americans a lot, like predatory business models in healthcare. People are completely outraged. They get a surprise bill from their emergency room that they thought they was covered under insurance, but in fact it's owned by some private company thing, and suddenly something they expected to cost only $100, they get a bill for like $30,000, and they're completely shocked. And it is totally predatory and deceptive. Well, the original work ethic had a lot of things to say about that, and they're right to be outraged, but they can tie that back in. Right, the things they already believe. So that's one of the reasons why. Whereas if I start from first premises, a lot of Americans will just be off the bus, even from those first premises, right? Until you tie it back to something that they are committed to at some level. And that's all about democracy, right? Because it's not the power of ideas just as ideas. It's the power of ideas to motivate people for collective action. And that's what we're seeing with a rise in labor union activism in the United States. Unions now, for the first time in decades, are really, really popular. And then, right, and that is creating a new kind of politics, actually, which has some potential, supposing that democracy survives the current administration.
Okay, any more question, Vidra?
I would have a small point.
Yeah, please.
I mean,
Axel.
I understand what you just said. Yeah, you want to start from where you are, and you think in the United States there is still a huge influence from the Protestant work ethics, and that makes historically sense. But on the other side, when I'm asking myself what the real demands of the population in the United States are now, for example, if I take New York, affordability, I'm not sure whether the best way to attack those questions and to address those questions is to go back to the Protestant work ethics. I think it would be much more convincing and probably successful to start from the moral economy I mentioned, yeah? Because the moral economy I mentioned starts from the very simple but evident idea that there is a right to subsistence for people who can't afford a living. And wouldn't it be more successful to start from those ethical intuitions, which are sitting in this long-standing tradition of moral economy, instead of using a Protestant work ethics, which I'm sure is out of the minds of most people in the United States. Yeah. So the moral economy has an evidence, an immediate evidence, and it could help us or people to address their demands much more concretely and much more convincingly.
Yeah, I can see that. I mean, there are other ways of thinking about it too, which are being articulated these days in terms of abundance. You know, we just aren't building enough houses, but also it's connected to the geography of opportunity in the United States, which is highly concentrated in a handful of major metropolitan areas that are very densely populated. It's difficult to build housing. This would raise completely different issues, but it has to do with the distribution of economic opportunities, spreading them out more. And you know, there's some interesting thinking going on along these lines. Middle out constitutionalism, right, which would require directing more economic opportunities to, say, mid-sized cities where there's still room to grow, build housing fairly cheaply. There's a lot of things actually that state investment could do to alter that, and certain kinds of altered regulations too.
Daron, any concluding comments? He's going to abstain. Okay. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Such rich comments. Thanks for organizing this, Dilip.
Thank you, Elizabeth, for agreeing to, have your book profiled on 23rd session of the Questioning the Present, and Axel and Daron for agreeing to serve as the respondents and offering such sustained and thoughtful comments. I think this has been a very productive meeting, and thank you so much. Hopefully our paths will cross again. Till then, goodbye.